There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the familiar weight of a friend beside you on a worn-out couch. You don't recognize them as watershed events at the time. There is no thunderclap, no sudden shift in the light. But later, when you trace the map of your own history, you see it. A sharp, definitive line drawn in the sand, separating the person you were before from the person you became after. For me, that line was drawn not by a sound, but by its absence. It was sketched into existence by a pocket of silence so dense and so loaded with unspoken gravity that it felt like it had its own weather system, a low-pressure zone that made it hard to breathe. It was the silence that followed a question so simple on its surface, yet so complex in its depths that it was like dropping a stone into a well and never hearing it hit the water. He was beside me, a solid, warm presence that had become as integral to the geography of my apartment as the sagging bookshelf or the single ficus tree slowly dying in the corner. Liam. His head was tipped back against the cushions, eyes closed, a faint line of exhaustion etched between his brows. We had been existing in this comfortable quiet for the better part of an hour, the television murmuring some forgettable documentary about deep-sea life, its blue light washing over us in gentle, hypnotic waves. This was our normal. His work as a consultant kept him in a perpetual state of transit, a man living out of a suitcase, ricocheting between airport lounges and sterile hotel rooms. My apartment had become his anchor, the one place he could land and simply be. The one place he could be still. And I, in my quiet, observational way, had become the keeper of that stillness. I was the curator of his calm, a role I had accepted without question because having him near, even in this fractured, platonic way, was a current I had long since stopped fighting. Then, without opening his eyes, he spoke. His voice was soft, roughened by fatigue, and it barely rose above the narrator's drone from the television. Leo, he'd said, his name a simple, familiar sound in the space between us. I had made a noise of acknowledgement, a non-committal hum that meant I'm here, I'm listening. He'd shifted, just slightly, the fabric of his sweatshirt whispering against the corduroy of the couch. The movement was enough to make me turn my head, to study the profile of his face in the flickering light, the strong line of his jaw, the faint stubble that was always there by evening, the way a single dark curl had fallen across his forehead. I had been cataloging these details for years, tucking them away like precious negatives in the darkroom of my mind. "Have you ever?" he started, and then he paused. The pause was a small chasm, and I felt a strange, unfounded anxiety begin to stir in my chest. He took a breath, a slow, deliberate inhale. Thought about us. And there it was. The question. He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The word us hung in the air, suddenly heavy, suddenly imbued with a meaning it had never carried before. It was no longer just Liam and Leo, the friends. It was something else. A hypothetical. A possibility. A door creaking open just a crack, revealing a room I had only ever allowed myself to dream of in the vaguest, most abstract terms. My own breath caught in my throat. My entire world, which had been a slow, predictable orbit around the sun of my affection for him, suddenly wobbled on its axis. Every defense mechanism I had built over the years, the carefully constructed walls of casual friendship, the gentle irony I used as a shield, the patient, resigned acceptance of our platonic bond, crumbled to dust in the space of that single sentence. I was left exposed, standing in the rubble of my own carefully maintained emotional architecture. My heart began a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs, a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. What could I possibly say? The truth felt like a confession, a declaration so enormous it would shatter the delicate ecosystem of our friendship. A lie felt like a betrayal, not just to him, but to the decade of silent, unwavering feeling I had harbored. So I said nothing. And he, in turn, went quiet. He didn't press. He didn't fidget. He just lay there, eyes still closed, breathing in that same slow, even rhythm, as if he hadn't just detonated a small, controlled explosive in the center of my life. The silence that bloomed in the wake of his question was profound. It was not the comfortable, easy silence we were used to. This was an active silence, a living thing. It was the silence of a held breath. It was the silence of two people standing on opposite sides of a chasm, both knowing that the next word spoken would either build a bridge or send one of them plummeting into the abyss. I sat there, paralyzed, my mind a screaming vortex of possibilities and fears, while the man on the television talked about the crushing pressure of the deep ocean, and I had never felt anything more relatable in my entire life. That was the line. That was the moment everything changed, even if nothing had happened at all. To understand the weight of that silence, you have to understand the foundation it was built upon. Liam and I were a study in contrasts, a friendship that, on paper, made little sense. We met in college, two celestial bodies from different solar systems somehow pulled into the same gravitational field. He was the sun, bright, loud, effortlessly drawing people into his orbit. He was a business major and a star on the university soccer team, a creature of motion and energy, his laughter a constant, booming presence in the crowded dining hall or across the sun-drenched quad. I was, by comparison, a distant moon, content in my own quiet, shadowed path. I was a fine arts major, specializing in photography, a discipline that suited my temperament perfectly. I lived behind a lens, an observer by nature, more comfortable documenting life than participating in it. Our meeting was as ordinary as our friendship would become extraordinary. We were assigned as partners for a mandatory public speaking course, a class that was Liam's natural habitat and my personal version of hell. He'd strode up to me after the first lecture, all easy grin and outstretched hand, while I was trying to become one with the lecture hall's drab wallpaper. He'd clapped me on the shoulder, declared we were going to ace the class, and proceeded to talk for 10 solid minutes about his strategy for our first presentation, barely taking a breath. I was mostly mute, overwhelmed by the sheer force of his personality, but he didn't seem to mind. He seemed to possess enough energy for the both of us, and from that day forward, he simply decided we were friends. He absorbed me into his life with the same casual confidence he did everything else. And I, to my own surprise, let him. There was a warmth to Liam, a genuine, uncomplicated goodness that was impossible to resist. He never seemed to notice my quietness or my tendency to retreat. Instead, he treated it as a feature, not a bug. He'd drag me to parties, but never pressure me to socialize, content to have me standing in a corner with him while he held court. He'd burst into my darkroom, reeking of sweat and victory after a game, and just sit on a stool in the red-tinged darkness, talking about the match while I carefully developed my prints. He didn't demand anything of me except my presence, and in return, he gave me a sense of belonging I had never known. He was the anchor, and I was the kite, and somehow, the string that connected us never broke. The feelings I developed for him were a slow bloom, a creeping vine that grew so gradually I barely noticed it until it had wrapped itself around my entire heart. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic lightning strike. It was more like the slow, patient process of a photograph developing in a chemical bath. At first, there was nothing, just a blank sheet. Then, slowly, faint lines began to emerge. The way my stomach would tighten when he'd smile at me from across a crowded room. The way I found myself cataloging the cadence of his voice, the specific shade of green in his eyes when the light hit them just right. Over time, these faint lines deepened, gained contrast and shadow, until the image was fully formed and undeniable. I was in love with my best friend. It was a fact I learned to live with, a truth I folded up and tucked away into a deep, hidden pocket of myself. It was a secret garden I tended to only in the dead of night, in the privacy of my own thoughts. To risk it, to speak it aloud, felt like an act of wanton destruction. Our friendship was a rare and beautiful thing, a perfectly balanced ecosystem. My confession would be the invasive species, the chemical spill, the thing that would poison the water and kill everything that had grown there. Liam was straight. He had a string of girlfriends throughout college, and after, women who were as bright and sunny as he was. I was the confidant, the one he came to for advice, the one who listened to him talk about first dates and anniversary plans. To change the terms of our relationship would be to break it. And so I became an expert in self-containment. I learned to live on the periphery of his life, loving him through the safe, removed filter of my camera lens. He became my unwitting muse. I have hundreds of photos of him, laughing with his teammates, studying in the library with a furrowed brow, sleeping on my lumpy college dorm couch. Each photograph was a stolen moment, a secret love letter that he would never know how to read. It was a quiet, aching, and ultimately sustainable form of love. It was enough. It had to be. The shift began subtly, a change in the atmospheric pressure that only I, with my years of studying the weather patterns of Liam's soul, could detect. It started after Sarah. She had been his girlfriend for 3 years, the longest and most serious relationship of his life. Everyone, including me, had assumed they would get married. She was lovely, kind, intelligent, funny. She fit with him. But their relationship didn't end with a bang. It ended with a whimper. It was a slow erosion, worn down by the realities of his job. He was a ghost in his own life, always leaving, always coming back just long enough to pack for the next trip. The long distance frayed them, the constant goodbyes and sterile video calls chipping away at their connection until there was nothing left but habit and a shared history. Their breakup was amicable, a sad, mutual acknowledgement that they were on different paths, but it left Liam unmoored. Sarah had been his home base, his destination. Without her, he was just a man in perpetual motion with nowhere to land. The restlessness that had always been a part of his charm, that kinetic energy that drew people to him, now seemed to curdle into a deep, pervasive loneliness. He tried to hide it, burying it under a frantic work schedule and forced cheerfulness, but I could see it. I could see it in the shadows under his eyes, in the way his laughter didn't quite reach them anymore, in the long pauses during our phone calls where he seemed to forget what he was saying. He was a ship without a harbor, drifting on an open, empty sea. And so, he started drifting toward me. My quiet, 2-bedroom apartment in a city he technically called home, but rarely inhabited became his port in the storm. It began with him just showing up after a long flight, too exhausted to face the emptiness of his own place. He'd drop his bags by the door, collapse onto my couch, and fall asleep with the television on, still in his travel clothes. I'd find him there in the morning, draped in the Afghan my grandmother had made, and I'd make him coffee before he had to rush off to a meeting. It was a simple act of friendship, of offering sanctuary to someone who needed it. I told myself it was nothing more than that. I was just being a good friend. But then the frequency increased. A night here became 2 nights. 2 nights became him just leaving his suitcase in my spare room. To make it easier, he started talking about my apartment as home base. He'd text me from a hotel in a different time zone. Can't wait to get back to the couch. The lines of our friendship, once so clearly defined, began to blur. He was weaving himself into the fabric of my daily life, becoming a permanent fixture in a space that had, for so long, been my solitary retreat. And with his presence came a new, terrifying, and exhilarating intimacy that I was utterly unprepared for. The walls I had so carefully constructed around my heart were beginning to show cracks, eroded by the constant, gentle pressure of his proximity. The quiet, sustainable love I had cultivated was threatening to become something loud and chaotic and entirely unsustainable. The ritual began on a cold night in November. A storm had blown in, a furious, lashing rain that rattled the window panes and made the city feel like a ship tossed at sea. Liam had been back for 2 days from a grueling trip to the West Coast, and the jet lag had hit him hard. He'd been a walking ghost, moving through my apartment with a slow, heavy exhaustion that was painful to watch. He'd fallen asleep on the couch around 9, and I'd left him there, pulling the Afghan over him before retreating to my own bedroom, my own quiet space. I was reading, the sound of the rain a soothing backdrop, when my bedroom door creaked open. I looked up, my heart giving a small, startled leap. Liam stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the dim light of the hallway. He was holding one of my spare pillows, looking lost and impossibly young. "My back is killing me," he whispered, his voice thick with sleep. "Your couch is a torture device." I just stared at him, my mind blank. Would it be weird if I just... He gestured vaguely toward the empty side of my queen-sized bed. "It's huge. I won't even, be on your side." This was it. A moment of choice. The sane, self-protective part of my brain was screaming at me to say no, to make an excuse, to offer him an air mattress, painkillers, anything but this. This was a boundary we had never crossed, a line drawn in permanent ink. Sharing a bed was not something platonic friends did, not in my world, not with the weight of everything I felt for him. But the other part of me, the part that had been quietly yearning for him for a decade, saw the raw exhaustion on his face, the genuine plea in his eyes. He wasn't asking for intimacy. He was asking for comfort, for a soft place to land. Saying no felt cruel. It felt like turning away a refugee seeking shelter from the storm raging both outside and inside him. "Okay," I heard myself say, my own voice a stranger. "Yeah, that's fine." He gave me a small, grateful smile that barely registered in the dim light. And then he walked around to the other side of the bed and slid under the covers, fully clothed in his sweats and t-shirt. He turned his back to me immediately, curling into a ball, and within minutes, the sound of his deep, even breathing filled the room. But for me, sleep was an impossibility. I lay there, rigid, every nerve ending firing. I was acutely aware of everything. The dip in the mattress from his weight, the faint, clean scent of his shampoo on the pillow he'd brought in, the warmth radiating from his body just a few inches from my own. It was a sweet, exquisite torture. I felt like a starving man sitting before a banquet, forbidden to touch a single thing. I lay awake for hours, listening to the rain and the sound of his breathing, my heart a frantic, silent drum in the vast, quiet space of my bedroom. That night was the beginning. It became our new normal, our unspoken ritual. He never asked again. He just started migrating from the couch to my bed sometime in the middle of the night, or, eventually, just starting there. The pretext of his bad back was quietly forgotten, replaced by an unspoken understanding. It was just easier. It was warmer. It was less lonely. For him, I suspect, it was a simple, uncomplicated comfort, a way to fend off the ghosts of his empty apartment and his fractured life. He was a man who expressed his needs through physical action, not words, and his need for an anchor, for simple human contact, manifested in this nightly pilgrimage to my bed. He'd fall asleep almost instantly, a deep, untroubled slumber that I envied. For me, it was a nightly exercise in radical self-control. Every night, I would lie beside him in the darkness, caught in a state of suspended animation, somewhere between dream and reality. My love for him, once a manageable, abstract concept, was now a tangible, physical presence. It was the heat of his back against mine. It was the weight of his arm, thrown across my waist in his sleep, an unconscious gesture that would send a jolt of electricity through my entire body. It was the soft puff of his breath against my neck when he'd turn toward me in the night. I learned the rhythms of his sleep, the way he'd twitch just before falling into a deep REM cycle, the soft, low snores he'd emit when he was truly exhausted. I was living in a state of hyper-awareness, my senses turned up to their highest possible frequency. The spare bedroom in my apartment, the one that was technically his, became a strange, symbolic space. He kept his suitcase there, his clothes neatly folded in the dresser. But the bed remained pristine, the covers perpetually unrumpled. The door to that room was always left ajar, a silent acknowledgement of the fiction we were maintaining. He had his space, and I had mine. The fact that we chose to share mine every night was a detail that we never, ever spoke of. It existed in the vast, uncharted territory between us, a truth we both navigated around with careful, deliberate steps. My internal monologue during those weeks was a relentless, looping debate. I would analyze every small gesture, every accidental touch, searching for meaning, for a sign that this was more than just convenience for him. Was the way he'd started to lean against me on the couch a little more than necessary a sign? Was the fact that he'd sometimes reach for my hand during a tense movie scene, his fingers lacing with mine for a moment before he seemed to catch himself and pull away, a flicker of something more? Or was I just projecting my own desires onto him, seeing patterns in the static? I was a detective searching for clues in a case where I was the only suspect, the only one who knew a crime of feeling was being committed. I was terrified of misinterpreting the signals, of making a move that would shatter the fragile peace of our domestic charade. But I was equally terrified of doing nothing, of letting these precious, stolen moments of closeness pass by without ever knowing if they could have been something more. I was trapped in a beautiful, agonizing limbo, and the tension was becoming unbearable. The ritual had been our silent language for nearly 2 months. It had evolved, grown more comfortable, more ingrained in the texture of our lives. The initial rigidity I felt had softened, replaced by a kind of resigned, bittersweet acceptance. I had learned to sleep beside him, to absorb the ambient comfort of his presence without letting the yearning consume me whole. The nights were still a form of gentle torture, but it was a pain I had grown accustomed to, like a chronic ache you learn to live with. We had built a fragile, beautiful world in the confines of my bedroom, a world with its own unspoken rules and delicate balance. But fragile things are made to be broken. That night, the night of the question, felt different from the start. The usual exhaustion that clung to Liam like a second skin was absent. He'd had a rare few days off, a lull in his travel schedule that had allowed him to actually rest. There was a lightness to him, a return of the old, easy energy I had missed. We had spent the day wandering through the city, I with my camera, he as my patient, rambling companion. We had fallen back into our old rhythms, the comfortable back and forth that had defined our friendship for a decade. It felt normal. It felt safe. When we got back to the apartment, we didn't retreat into our usual evening quiet. We cooked dinner together, a messy, chaotic affair with too much garlic and a lot of laughter. The space between us felt charged, but not with the usual tension of unspoken feelings. It was charged with a simple, uncomplicated joy. It felt like a glimpse of a life I had never dared to imagine, a domesticity that was not a performance or a convenience, but something real and shared. Later, on the couch, the quiet that fell between us wasn't born of fatigue. It was a comfortable, sated silence, the kind that follows a good meal and a good day. And that, I think, is why his question landed with such force. It came not from a place of loneliness or need, but from a place of contentment. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a quiet, curious exploration. Have you ever, thought about us? It recontextualized everything. It suggested that he, too, had been living in the unspoken space between us, that he, too, had been aware of the subtle shifts in our dynamic. It suggested that the nightly ritual was not just about his comfort, but perhaps about his curiosity. As I sat there in the deafening silence that followed, my mind raced. This was the moment. The door he had cracked open was now swinging wider. All I had to do was walk through it. All I had to do was say yes. A single word. Yes, I think about it every second of every day. Yes, my entire life has been a quiet meditation on the concept of US. Yes, I am hopelessly, irrevocably in love with you. But the fear was a physical thing, a hand squeezing my throat. The risk felt immense, catastrophic. What if I was wrong? What if this was just a fleeting thought for him, a moment of idle curiosity, and my confession would burden him, would change the way he looked at me forever? The friendship we had was real, and deep, and precious. It had been my one constant for my entire adult life. Was I willing to gamble it all on a whispered question in the dark? The silence stretched on, growing heavier with each passing second. I could feel his stillness beside me, a waiting presence. He wasn't pushing, but he wasn't retreating either. He was holding the space open, giving me the time and the room to answer. And in that act of patient waiting, I felt a flicker of courage. He wouldn't have asked if he wasn't prepared for some version of the truth. He had taken the first, terrifying step. The least I could do was meet him halfway. But words failed me. The machinery of my voice simply would not engage. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I shifted on the couch, a small, deliberate movement, and I turned my body to face him. I didn't say anything. I just looked at him, letting my eyes convey what my voice could not. I let him see the fear, and the hope, and the decade of unspoken affection that was swirling in their depths. I let him see all of it. He must have felt the movement, because his own eyes fluttered open. They found mine in the dim, blue light of the television. His expression was unreadable at first, a mask of quiet contemplation. We just looked at each other for a long moment, the world shrinking to the few feet of space between us. The sounds of the documentary, the hum of the city outside, it all faded away into a dull, distant roar. There was only the charged stillness, the silent conversation happening in the space between our eyes. Section then, a change. Something in his expression softened. The mask cracked, and underneath was a vulnerability that mirrored my own. It was a look of such raw, unguarded honesty that it took my breath away. He knew. In that moment, I was certain that he knew. Maybe he had known for a long time. He slowly, tentatively, raised a hand. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his fingers hovering in the air between us, before he gently cupped my jaw. His thumb stroked softly against my skin, a feather-light touch that sent a shiver down my spine. The contact was electric, a live wire. It was not the accidental, unconscious touch of a sleeping friend. This was intentional. This was deliberate. This was an answer. His eyes searched mine, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was a barely audible whisper, so quiet I felt it more than I heard it. "Can I?" he began, his gaze dropping to my lips, and then back up to my eyes. "Leo, is it okay if I kiss you?" And the fear, the towering, monstrous fear that had held me paralyzed for so long, simply evaporated. It was replaced by a wave of relief so profound it felt like I was finally letting out a breath I had been holding for 10 years. He was asking. He wasn't assuming. He wasn't taking. He was asking for permission, acknowledging the fragility of the moment, of our friendship, of me. He was giving me the choice. He was giving me all the power. I couldn't form a word, so I just nodded. A small, jerky movement, but it was enough. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to stop him. His gaze never left mine until the very last second. And then his lips met mine. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of quiet discovery. It was hesitant and soft and breathtakingly gentle. It was a question and a confession and an apology all at once. It was the taste of salt and uncertainty and a decade of waiting. It was the feeling of a lock finally clicking into place, of a door swinging open onto a room I had only ever dreamed of. In that single, feather-light press of his lips against mine, the entire world realigned. The line that had been drawn in the sand by his question was now carved in stone by his kiss. There was no going back. The before was officially over. The after had begun. The aftermath was not the explosion of joy and certainty I might have dreamed of. Instead, it was defined by a quiet, unnerving fragility. When the kiss ended, we didn't speak. We simply rested our foreheads together, breathing the same air, our hearts beating a frantic, unsynchronized rhythm. The silence that returned was different yet again. It was not the silence of waiting or the silence of comfort. It was the silence of consequence. The air was thick with it, shimmering with the enormity of what had just happened. We had crossed a line, a definitive, irreversible boundary, and neither of us seemed to know what to do on this new, uncharted side. After a few minutes that felt like an eternity, Liam pulled back. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at his own hands, which were resting on his knees, as if he'd never seen them before. The vulnerability that had been so raw and open on his face just moments before was gone, replaced by a shuttered, confused expression. I could almost see the thoughts warring inside his head, the panic beginning to set in. He had acted on an impulse, a feeling that had likely been building for months, but now, in the stark reality of the aftermath, he was struggling to reconcile the action with his own identity, with the life he had known. I think I should go to my own bed," he mumbled, not to me, but to the floor. The words were a physical blow. He stood up abruptly, the sudden movement feeling violent in the quiet room. He walked, almost fled, to the spare room and closed the door behind him. Not ajar, as was the ritual. Closed. The click of the latch was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was a sound of separation, of retreat. I sat alone on the couch, the warmth of his body still imprinted on the cushion next to me, the ghost of his lips still tingling on mine. The profound relief I had felt was rapidly being replaced by a cold, creeping dread. I had misinterpreted everything. It had been a mistake, a moment of weakness, of loneliness on his part, that he now regretted. The beautiful, fragile thing we had just created had shattered before it had even fully formed. The morning was a landscape of excruciating awkwardness. I woke up on the couch, having not been able to bring myself to go to my own bed. I heard him stirring in the spare room, the water running, the quiet footsteps. I braced myself for a conversation, for an apology, for something. Instead, when he emerged, he was already dressed for the outside world, his bag packed and slung over his shoulder. He still wouldn't look at me directly. "Hey," he said, his voice strained. "Got a call. Project in Chicago got moved up. I have to catch a flight in 2 hours." It was a lie. I knew it was a lie. His schedule was on the shared calendar on our phones. He wasn't supposed to leave for 3 more days. But I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I'll call you from there, he said, already moving toward the door. We'll talk. And then he was gone. The front door closed behind him, and I was left in a silence that was no longer active or waiting or consequential. It was simply empty. It was the silence of abandonment. The fear I had of ruining our friendship had come true in the most brutal way imaginable. I hadn't just ruined it. I had scared him away. The one constant in my life, the anchor that had held me steady for so long, had just untethered himself and sailed away, leaving me adrift in the wreckage. The week that followed was one of the longest of my life. The silence from him was absolute. No call, no text, nothing. My apartment, once his sanctuary and my shared space, felt cavernous and hostile. Every corner reminded me of him. The couch where he'd asked the question, the empty space in my bed, the closed door of the spare room. I walked through the rooms like a ghost, haunted by the memory of his presence. I tried to work, to lose myself in the familiar process of developing photographs, but my hands shook. I looked at the images I had taken of him over the years, the hundreds of secret love letters, and they felt like documents of my own foolishness. The hurt was a deep, physical ache in my chest, but underneath the hurt, a slow, simmering anger began to build. It wasn't just that he had regretted the kiss. It was the cowardice of his retreat, the lie, the silence. He had initiated everything. He had asked the question. He had asked for the kiss. He had opened the door and then slammed it shut in my face, leaving me to deal with the emotional fallout alone. The patient, understanding friend I had been for a decade was being eroded by a profound sense of injustice. It wasn't fair. After 10 years of my quiet, respectful silence, I deserved more than his panicked, deafening silence. On the 7th day, I couldn't take it anymore. The anger finally outweighed the fear and the hurt. I was done waiting. I was done being a passive observer in my own life. I took out my phone, my fingers trembling slightly, and I typed out a message. It was short, direct, and left no room for evasion. We need to talk. Tonight. This silence is not okay. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. My heart hammered against my ribs as I waited. The 3 little dots appeared, disappeared, and then reappeared. For a terrifying minute, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then a reply. You're right. I'm sorry. My flight lands at 8. Can I come over? The confrontation, when it happened, was quieter than I had imagined. There was no shouting, no dramatic accusations. There was just a heavy, sorrowful tension that filled the room as soon as he walked through the door. He looked terrible. The exhaustion that had been absent before was back with a vengeance. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He dropped his bag and just stood in the entryway, looking at me, his face a portrait of guilt and confusion. I'm so sorry, Leo, he whispered, and his voice broke on my name. I'm an idiot. I panicked. I just nodded, gesturing for him to come in, to sit down. We ended up on the couch, sitting on opposite ends, a vast, corduroy canyon between us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I was waiting for him to explain, and he seemed to be struggling to find the words. Finally, he started talking, his voice low and halting. He told me about the week, about the panic attack he'd had on the plane to Chicago, about how he'd walked through his work meetings in a daze, his mind replaying the kiss over and over again. He confessed that the feelings he had for me weren't new, that they had been building for months, a confusing, unsettling undercurrent in his life that he had been trying to ignore. He'd told himself it was just loneliness, just the stress of the breakup with Sarah, just his reliance on me as his only stable point. But the kiss had made it real, undeniable. I've never felt that way about a guy, he said, staring at the floor. About anyone, really. Not like that. It was quiet and huge, all at once, and it terrified me. It felt like my whole world had tilted on its axis, and I didn't know which way was up anymore. So I ran. It was a stupid, cowardly thing to do, and I've spent every minute of this week hating myself for it. For hurting you. As I listened to him, the anger inside me began to dissipate, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it almost knocked the wind out of me. I was looking at a man who was just as scared as I had been, if not more so. I had had a decade to get used to my feelings for him, to build a life around them. He was experiencing them all at once, a sudden, disorienting tidal wave. My fear had been about losing a friendship. His fear was about losing his entire sense of self. When he finished, I took a deep breath. It was my turn. I told him everything. Not just about the last few months, but about all of it. About the 10 years of quiet affection, of watching him from behind my camera, of learning to live with a love I never thought would be returned. I told him about the agonizing joy of our nightly ritual, of lying beside him and feeling both complete and completely alone. I explained the architecture of my silence, the reasons for my caution. I laid my entire heart bare on the cushions of that couch, showing him all the hidden rooms and secret gardens I had kept locked away for so long. The conversation was a floodgate opening. We talked for hours, the sky outside my window turning from inky black to a bruised purple, and then to a soft, hopeful gray. We talked through our fears, our confusion, our hopes. It was messy and painful and profoundly honest. He cried. I cried. We moved from the opposite ends of the couch until we were sitting side by side, our knees touching, the chasm between us finally bridged by the raw, unvarnished truth. There was no magic solution, no sudden, perfect clarity. There was just the shared, dawning realization that we were both fumbling in the dark, and that maybe, just maybe, it was better to fumble together than to be lost alone. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the blinds, casting long stripes of light across the floor, a new kind of silence settled over us. It was not a silence of tension or comfort or consequence. It was a silence of pure, exhausted peace. It was the quiet that comes after the storm has passed, leaving the air clean and calm. Liam turned to me, his eyes red-rimmed but clear for the first time in a week. I don't know what this is, he said softly, or what we're supposed to do now, but I know I don't want to run from it anymore. And I don't want to do it without you. Okay, I whispered. Me neither. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. It wasn't a hesitant, fleeting gesture this time. It was firm. It was certain. It was a promise. Can we go to sleep? He asked, his voice thick with a bone-deep weariness that I shared. Together? For real this time. I nodded, and hand in hand, we walked to my bedroom. There was no pretext, no fiction. He didn't even glance at the closed door of the spare room. We climbed into my bed, the sheets cool against our skin, and we curled up together, facing each other. He pulled the covers up over us, and I rested my head on his chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart under my ear. He wrapped his arms around me, holding me close, and for the first time, it was not an unconscious act in the middle of the night. It was a choice, a deliberate, conscious act of holding on. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in a week, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. We didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, held securely in his arms, I felt like I was finally home. The days that followed our marathon of confession were quiet, tentative things. We were like two people learning a new language, one made not of words, but of small gestures and shared spaces. The grand, dramatic breakthrough of our talk gave way to a much more subtle and, in many ways, more profound process of realignment. We were rebuilding our world from the ground up, but this time, on a foundation of honesty instead of unspoken rules and careful omissions. The architecture of our relationship was being redrafted, the walls between us torn down to create a single, open, light-filled space. The new normal began with coffee. The morning after our talk, I woke up first. I slipped out of bed, leaving him sleeping, a peaceful, untroubled expression on his face that I had only ever seen when he was in the deepest parts of slumber. In the kitchen, I started the coffee maker, the familiar ritual a comforting anchor in this new, uncharted territory. A few minutes later, he appeared in the doorway, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He was wearing a pair of my sweatpants and an old t-shirt, and the sight of him looking so soft and domestic in my clothes sent a fresh wave of something warm and hopeful through me. He didn't say anything. He just walked up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist, and rested his chin on my shoulder, inhaling the scent of the brewing coffee. "Morning," he mumbled into my neck, his voice still rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my hand coming up to rest on his, which were clasped over my stomach. We stood like that for a few minutes, just swaying slightly, watching the dark liquid drip into the pot. It was a simple, mundane moment, but it felt monumental. It was the first conscious act of our new reality, an easy, unforced intimacy that required no analysis, no second-guessing. It just was. This was not the desperate clinging of a lonely man or the hesitant touch of a confused one. This was the easy affection of a partner. The biggest change was the absence of plausible deniability. The charade was over. Liam didn't go back to the spare room. His suitcase remained there, but he moved his toiletries into my bathroom. His toothbrush appeared in the holder next to mine, a small, plastic declaration of intent. He started leaving a change of clothes in my closet instead of living out of his luggage. He was, slowly and deliberately, integrating his life into mine, not as a guest, but as a resident. The door to the spare room remained closed, no longer a symbol of separation, but simply a marker of a room that was no longer needed for its original, fictional purpose. Our nights transformed completely. The sweet, agonizing torture of lying beside him, pretending to be asleep, was replaced by the profound peace of falling asleep in his arms. The conversations we'd never had during the day now spilled out in the darkness of the bedroom. We would lie there for hours, whispering about everything and nothing. Our fears about what our friends or families might think, our silly, half-formed dreams for the future, the stories from our childhoods we had somehow never shared. The bedroom, once a space of silent tension, became our sanctuary, a confessional, a place where we could be our most vulnerable, unguarded selves. The physical language between us evolved as well. It was a slow, gentle exploration. Holding hands became as natural as breathing. An arm slung around his shoulder while we watched a movie, a quick kiss on the forehead before he left for a meeting, a hand resting on the small of my back as we navigated a crowded street. These were not the grand, passionate gestures of a whirlwind romance. They were the small, quiet affirmations of a deep and growing affection, the bricks and mortar of a home we were building together. The kisses were still gentle, still full of a kind of quiet awe, as if we were both still marveling at the fact that this was real, that this was allowed. It wasn't without its moments of awkwardness or fear. There were times I would catch a flicker of the old panic in his eyes, a momentary retreat when we were in public, as if he'd suddenly remembered that the world was watching and he wasn't sure what role he was supposed to play. But instead of running, he would now turn to me. He would seek out my hand, his fingers gripping mine tightly, as if to anchor himself. And I would squeeze back, a silent reassurance. I'm here. We're in this together. We were learning to be each other's safe harbor, a place to retreat to when the outside world felt too loud or too judgmental. We were a two-man lifeboat on a sometimes stormy sea. One afternoon, about a month after our talk, I was in my darkroom, the red light casting its familiar, otherworldly glow on everything. I was developing some of the photos from the day we had spent wandering the city, the day that had ended with his question. As the images slowly emerged in the chemical bath, I saw them with new eyes. There was one of him, laughing, head thrown back, the sunlight catching in his hair. Before, I would have seen this as another of my secret love letters, a beautiful, painful reminder of what I couldn't have. But now, it was just a picture of the man I loved. The man who was, at that very moment, in the next room, making a mess in my kitchen while trying to follow a recipe he'd found online. The ache was gone. The sense of distance, of being an observer behind a lens, had vanished. I was no longer just documenting his life. I was a part of it. The door to the darkroom creaked open, and Liam poked his head in, squinting in the dim red light. "Hey," he said. "Am I allowed in here? I brought you something." He stepped inside, holding 2 mugs of tea. He navigated the cluttered space carefully and handed one to me. He didn't say anything about the photos hanging up to dry, the dozens of images of his own face staring back at him. He just stood beside me, sipping his tea, his shoulder pressed against mine. "What are you working on?" he asked, his voice soft. "Just some stuff from that day," I said. "Before everything." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the image of his laughing face. "I look happy," he said, a note of surprise in his voice. I don't think I felt happy then. I just felt confused and scared, and like I was on the verge of something I didn't understand. He turned to look at me, his green eyes luminous in the strange light. "I think I was happy because I was with you." It was such a simple, direct statement, delivered with a quiet certainty that still felt new and breathtaking to me. It was a truth he had discovered about himself, and he was sharing it with me as a gift. I was always happy when I was with you, I confessed, my voice thick with emotion. He smiled, a slow, gentle curve of his lips. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering on my skin. I know, he whispered. I think I always knew that, too. I just didn't know what it meant. He leaned in and kissed me, a slow, sweet kiss that tasted of tea and discovery and the profound, quiet peace of finally being understood. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together. It was a silence no longer filled with unspoken yearning or anxious calculation, but with a deep, abiding sense of peace. It was the silence of two people who had navigated a terrifying labyrinth of fear and confusion and had found each other on the other side. It was the silence of a shared home, of a future that was no longer a vague, terrifying question mark, but a quiet, hopeful promise. The line that had been drawn on that ordinary Tuesday night had not been an ending, after all. It had been the beginning of everything.